And President Trump will travel to Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday, where protests continue a week after the police shooting of Jacob Blake. The shooting in Kenosha and the protests that followed left two anti-racism protesters dead and amplified the divide between police and the communities that they are tasked to serve. The president is scheduled to meet with members of law enforcement and survey the damage caused by the recent unrest. For more on all of this, let's bring in CBS News correspondent Nikole Killion from the White House. Nikole, it's good to see you. We know that the president is planning to meet with law enforcement officials. Does he also plan on meeting with Jacob Blake or his family or any of the anti-racism protest leaders?
Well, Lana, we're awaiting word from the White House to see if that will come to fruition. We do know that the president and the White House has reached out to the Blake family a number of times, but has yet to connect, that they're still working to contact the family. At last check, the attorney for the Blake family, Ben Crump, told our Face the Nation that the family has not yet received a call from the president. So in the meantime, we continue to watch and wait. But as you mentioned, the White House did say that the president does intend to meet with law enforcement and kind of survey the damage on the ground, but his visit is not necessarily being welcomed by some in Wisconsin, particularly the state's lieutenant governor, who tweeted out this morning that we need healing, not a barrel of gasoline rolling in.
Yeah, Nikole, you know, Kenosha is just the latest city that has been the site of either these protests or police shootings. Overall, what is the White House saying about this moment of reconciliation in our country for racial justice?
Well, as far as the situation in Portland is concerned, certainly we saw overnight the president, and early this morning the president tweeting and retweeting a number of times, calling the city's mayor incompetent, saying that the National Guard is at the ready. And really, as far as the Trump supporters that did go into Portland, praising them as a great patriots. You know, what we're hearing from White House officials, some of whom were on some of the Sunday shows this morning, is that you know, they are pinning the blame on these cities, particularly those that are run by Democrats. And in the case of Portland, you know, the administration argues that, look, we have offered our assistance and it has been refused by Portland's mayor. And so, you know, the White House is really arguing, and that by the White House, I mean the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, also the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows. You know, they're arguing, look, you know, if you would just allow us to come in and help, we could squash this. That's also some of the messaging we saw in the president's tweets. Democrats, on the other hand, are saying, look, it's the president's own rhetoric that is really fanning the flames here, not just in places like Portland, but in places like Kenosha and elsewhere. And it's up to the president to speak to the nation and to try to address that. That's what we heard from some of the Democrats on some of the Sunday shows, whether it was the former Vice President Joe Biden's campaign manager, Kate Bedingfield. Also, we heard from Val Demings, who is a House Democrat. And so, you know, we continue to see this back and forth between the White House arguing this message of law and order, and again, Democrats saying that really it's up to the president to restrain and restrict some of his language to try to bring these situations under control.
Yeah, we've heard the president talk a lot about law and order and talk about trying to stop these protests, and also seen him recently, Nikole, eliminating that line between violent protests and calls for justice that are the bedrock of U.S. protests and American democracy. I'm wondering, though, in addition to talking about how to bring in law and justice, are we hearing anything from White House officials about these underlying problems of systemic racism in our country and how this administration would attempt to try and rectify some of these problems?
Well, I think that is something that, again, you know, Democrats feel is lacking from this White House. You know, certainly as far as Jacob Blake is concerned, you know, the president didn't really make any references to the shooting throughout the week of the Republican National Convention. He gave his first really reaction to the case on Friday night, the day after the convention, saying it didn't look right to him and that his administration is investigating. He did did make a mention of Kenosha in his acceptance speech. We also heard the vice president reference it in his comments during the convention, but more again, kind of in the context of that law and order messaging and getting control of the streets.
Well, Nikole, as we reported earlier, the U.S. death toll from coronavirus is expected to pass 200,000 over the next couple weeks. Last week, during the Republican National Convention, speakers tended to use the past tense when discussing the pandemic, as though it was in the rearview mirror already. I'm wondering, is that messaging paying off for the president?
Yeah, well, I don't know if we want to say it's paying off in the context of talking about lost lives. You know, what I can say in terms of the messaging, you know, it's a continuum of what we've seen certainly from the president and the administration. You know, they feel that they have tried to marshal resources to combat this virus. You know, whether you look at the messaging from the convention or you look at the messaging during some of the president's press conferences that he's had surrounding the coronavirus. And again, you know, Democrats argue to the contrary, pointing at that very death toll, that it has continued to escalate, and that really, you know, voters should judge the president on that, you know, he shouldn't have allowed this many lives to be lost, and that the responsibility lies on him. You know, that being said, I think when you look at the conventions as to whether or not either candidate really got a bounce out of them, you know, the latest polling shows that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. An ABC Ipsos poll shows about 31% of respondents have a favorable view of the president coming out of the Republican National Convention. That's about where it was before the convention started. And similarly, for former Vice President Joe Biden, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll that showed he had a 47 to 40% advantage over the president, which is about what it was before the Democratic National Convention. So, you know, granted, those are just two polls. Certainly, I'm sure there will be more to be done, but that does indicate, you know, how hardened, you know, some political positions are, you know, when it comes to perhaps some voters out there, in the sense that perhaps many minds weren't necessarily changed by either of these conventions.
Yeah, okay. Nikole Killion, thank you.